Only a few ships in American history have had as illustrious a career as the heavy cruiser USS Portland. Designated CA-33 and affectionately known by her crew as the Sweet Pea, she is one of the most decorated ships in the history of the United States Navy. She earned 16 battle stars and a Navy Unit Commendation Award for her efforts during the Pacific War, efforts which included participation in one of the most chaotic and violent surface actions of the war. Portland also saw plenty of action screening aircraft carriers and providing fire support. No matter the job, the tenacious Sweet Pea and her resilient crew got it done. Portland's keel was laid down on February 17, 1930, at the Bethlehem Shipbuilding Corporation's Four River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. She was considered a light cruiser when she was laid down due to her thin armor, but when she was launched a little over 2 years later in May of 1932, she had been reclassified as a heavy cruiser in accordance with the terms of the First London Naval Treaty, which formally defined cruisers with 8-inch main batteries as heavy cruisers. She had an overall length of 610 feet, a beam of 66 feet, and displaced just under 10,000 tons. As previously mentioned, she carried a main battery of 9 8-inch 55 caliber guns that were housed in 3 triple turrets, a super-firing pair forward and 1 aft. Her guns were capable of firing a 260-pound shell over 18 miles at their maximum elevation of 45 degrees. For air defense, Portland initially was equipped with 8 5-inch 25 caliber guns and 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns, although this would change considerably over time, as new, more effective weapon systems were introduced. Like all of the U.S. treaty cruisers, Portland was thinly armored, in order to keep her under the treaty limit of 10,000 tons. Her belt was 3¼ to 5 inches thick, and she had 2½ inches of deck armor. Another 1½ inches of armor protected her barbettes. Portland was powered by 8 oil-fired boilers, which provided the steam for her 4 reduction steam turbines. Each turbine drove 1 screw. She was rated for 107,000 shaft horsepower and could plow through the sea at a brisk 32 knots. Portland had a range of 10,000 nautical miles when cruising at 15 knots. Portland was equipped with 2 aircraft catapults amidships and had a hangar located in the forward part of her aft deck house. She had a peacetime complement of 848 officers and enlisted men. Portland was commissioned into the fleet on February 23, 1933. She commenced operations in the Atlantic soon after, which included aiding the airship USS Akron when it crashed off of the New Jersey coast in foul weather. She was the first Navy vessel to reach the crash site and began coordinating the search and rescue effort as other ships arrived on scene. After being transferred to the scouting force, which was based in the Pacific, Portland escorted USS Houston, which was carrying President Roosevelt from San Diego to Charleston, South Carolina via Panama in October of 1935. FDR and his entourage enjoyed sightseeing and numerous fishing opportunities along the way. Portland returned to the West Coast and spent the remainder of the interwar years with the Scouting Force, Cruiser Division 5 and later, the United States Pacific Fleet, conducting exercises, training, and a number of goodwill missions. Portland stood out of Pearl Harbor on December 5, 1941, with Task Force 12, which was built around the aircraft carrier Lexington. The task force's mission was to ferry 18 Marine Corps dive bombers to Midway Island. On the morning of the 7th, the task force was about 500 nautical miles southeast of Midway when it received news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. She spent the rest of December and the early part of 1942 screening Lexington as the task force patrolled the Pacific, looking for any offensive action they could take. After an overhaul at Mare Island during February and convoy escort duty in March, Portland was transferred to Task Force 17 in late April and would escort the USS Yorktown during the coming months. She put up a dogged defense of Yorktown at the Battle of the Coral Sea and took on over 700 Lexington survivors after the carrier was sunk. And although she didn't suffer any onboard casualties herself during the battle, 4 of her sailors who had been transferred to the fleet oiler Neosho were lost when that ship was sunk. On May 16th, Portland received a new commander, Captain Lawrence T. Dubose. He would distinguish himself as her commanding officer in the coming months as she entered the fray off Guadalcanal. Portland would do much of the same work at Midway as she had done in the Coral Sea, doggedly fending off air attacks and once again taking on survivors of a stricken carrier after Yorktown was abandoned. Portland transferred them to the submarine tender Fulton on the 6th of June and spent the 7th searching for downed naval aviators before joining Saratoga's task force the next day. After spending the rest of June regrouping in Hawaiian waters, Portland and her crew got underway in mid-July with Enterprise's Task Force 16 and conducted exercises on the way to the South Pacific in anticipation of what was next on their itinerary, the invasion of Guadalcanal. These rigidly programmed gunnery exercises gave the Sweet Pea's gunners and fire controlmen a chance to calibrate and fine-tune their directors and radar sets for what was ahead of them, for everyone within the confines of the ship knew that a surface action with the Imperial Japanese Navy in the coming weeks was inevitable. Portland began the Solomons campaign by screening Enterprise as the carrier's aviators struck targets on Tulagi and Guadalcanal during August 7th and 8th. She would remain in the company of Enterprise for the rest of August, including the carrier clash at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on the 24th. She put up a relentless defense of the Big E that afternoon and splashed 2 attackers, but Enterprise was struck 3 times by dive bombers. After escorting Enterprise back to Pearl for repairs, Portland secretly steamed to the Gilberts in the company of the light cruiser San Juan to conduct a raid on the afternoon of October 15th. The cruisers attacked Japanese shipping near Tarawa Atoll, damaging a transport and a destroyer before withdrawing and rejoining the Enterprise task group near the Solomons on the 23rd. Portland's next chapter was the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands on the 26th, and this is where she suffered her first wartime damage as one of her 1.1-inch guns exploded while firing. Not long after that, another one of her AA guns depressed too low and hit its splinter shield. These incidents injured 19 men. Then, just before noon, a Japanese submarine was sighted, and soon after Portland was hit by 3 torpedoes on her starboard side amidships, with another glancing off her rudder. Luck was with the Sweet Pea on this day, as none of them detonated, likely because the submarine was too close and they hadn't had time to arm. One sailor, George Dolezal, actually heard the torpedoes striking Portland's hull not far from where he lay in the ship's sickbay. After retiring to New Caledonia, Portland was back at sea on November 8th to escort a supply convoy bound for Guadalcanal. She entered Iron Bottom Sound early on the 12th and began patrolling the sound as the transports unloaded their cargoes. That afternoon, Portland helped fight off a Japanese air attack before assembling into a column formation with the rest of the force after dark, in preparation for a sweep through the Sound, as the Tokyo Express was expected to be making a run to the embattled island that evening. Portland was the 3rd cruiser in the column, behind Atlanta and San Francisco, and ahead of Helena and Juneau. All hands were tired after 2 days of a nearly continuous Condition 1 setting and the tension that came with it. Just before 1:30, radar sets aboard several U.S. ships, including Portland, began detecting Japanese warships west of Savo. For another 15 minutes, the opposing forces closed on each other, and then all hell broke loose. As Portland made a westerly course change, she was flooded by blinding searchlight beams from her port side. Her first 8-inch salvo soon rang out, followed in short order by a second, and a large explosion was seen in the vicinity of her target, which was probably the destroyer Akatsuki, which blew up and was left sinking. At this point, every gun she could bear got into the fray in a chaotic arena of all-out combat, no greater than 4 miles in diameter, as all ships were shooting as rapidly as they could at point-blank ranges. Just before 2 a.m., Portland was firing at various targets when the starboard side of her stern was suddenly ripped open by a Japanese torpedo. According to her executive officer, Commander T.R. Worth, who was located in Battle 2 during the engagement, the ship was lifted and was shaken like a mouse in the jaws of a cat. The blast destroyed 18 compartments, tore off her 2 inboard screws, and disabled turret number 3. A large piece of hull plating extended out into the sea and acted much like a rudder, which forced the Sweet Pea into a sharp turn to starboard that her jammed rudder was helpless to correct. Nothing her helmsman did could straighten her course. As Portland finished her first clockwise circle, the Japanese battleship Hiei appeared ahead at 4,000 yards. Portland's forward turrets started barking out salvos and hit the Japanese battle wagon 10 to 14 times. Hiei responded in kind, and Portland was hit by two 14-inch bombardment projectiles. One holed the unarmored airplane hangar and spewed fragments throughout the immediate vicinity, and the other exploded on contact with her armor belt, but failed to penetrate it. She suffered 18 killed and 17 wounded in the night's action. Portland continued steaming in circles and could not retire east with the other survivors of the action, and, as the new day dawned, she began firing on the abandoned hulk of the destroyer Udachi. 6 salvos later, the Udachi exploded, rolled over, and sank rapidly. Portland's steering problems were eventually corrected with aid from the tugboat Bobolink, who pushed against her starboard bow as the cruiser moved forward to counteract the action caused by the protruding hull plating at her aft end. With some help from a patrol boat and some Higgins boats, she began making her way across the Sound to a little nook between Tulagi and Florida Island. On the 14th, Captain DuBose backed Portland into the Tulagi PT boat base. He lassoed a tree with the stern line and had working parties hew and haul masses of foliage from the jungle to help conceal the Sweet Pea from Japanese onlookers. Over the next 10 days, Portland's dead were buried in the Marine Cemetery on Tulagi, and temporary repairs were effected, including the installation of discovered I-beams that the ex-tenants of Florida Island had abandoned. A team of Seabees helped to lug them aboard, and, after the wreckage was cleared and the bulkheads had been shored, her crew joined with the recruited talent to weld the beams into place between the starboard waist and the remnants of her stern. On November 23rd, she was towed out of her berth at Tulagi by the fleet tug Navajo and began making her way to the Cockatoo Dockyard in Sydney, Australia, for preliminary repairs. Following stops at Samoa and Pearl Harbor, she arrived at the Mare Island Navy Yard on March 3, 1943. Here, her battle damage was fully repaired, and she was overhauled, which included the addition of 4 quadruple and 4 twin 40mm Bofors mounts and 17 single-mounted 20mm Oerlikons. This work was completed by mid-May, and she got underway on the 18th to conduct sea trials off the Southern California coast. Portland then headed north in mid-June to join the campaign in the Aleutian Islands. She bombarded Kiska Island on July 26th and again on August 17th, before spending the next few months alternating between Pearl Harbor and San Francisco. Portland began the Gilbert Islands campaign by bombarding Tarawa Atoll on November 20th and supported the landings there for several days by providing on-call fire support. She incurred minor damage during this period when a destroyer dropped a depth charge near her after erroneously detecting a Japanese sub. In December, she moved on to the Marshall Islands and began escorting the new Essex-class carrier USS Lexington. She returned to Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day to repair the damage done to her rudder and propellers by the depth charge. Portland was back in the Central Pacific by the end of January, where she shelled the island of Darrett for 30 minutes before it was discovered that there were no Japanese ashore. She supported operations at Enuitak Atoll in early February, where she provided the preliminary shore bombardment of Perry Island ahead of amphibious landings there on February 19th. She then screened the carriers of the Fast Carrier Task Force until early April. Portland then covered the landings at Hollandia and Tanamera Bay on New Guinea in late April. Afterwards, she bombarded Truk and Satawan atolls, before returning once more to Mare Island for an extensive overhaul, which was completed by August 1944. Portland returned to the fleet in time to participate in the preliminary bombardment of Peleliu and Angar from September 12th to the 14th. She then supported U.S. Marines ashore by providing fire support from the 15th through the 29th, when she retired to Manus Island for rest and replenishment. She then arrived off Leyte on October 17th to begin supporting the effort to retake the Philippines. Over the course of the next 2 days, she hammered away at enemy positions in preparation for the landings on the 20th. She spent the next few days dodging Japanese air attacks, before she took up station at the northern end of Surigao Strait on the evening of the 24th with the rest of the fire support force of the U.S. 7th Fleet. This force included 6 veteran battleships, 5 of which had been present during the attack on Pearl Harbor, 4 heavy and 4 light cruisers, and 28 destroyers. Just after 3 a.m. on the morning of the 25th, Portland began tracking the Japanese Southern Force as they made their way up through the strait. At 3:53, USS West Virginia opened up on what was left of the Southern Force, and she was joined in quick succession by the rest of the U.S. battle line. Portland struck the veteran Japanese cruiser Mogami multiple times with 8-inch shell fire, including a hit to her bridge, which killed her captain and executive officer. After the battleship Yamashiro was sunk by a combination of shell fire and torpedoes, Mogami and the destroyer Shigure attempted to retire south back down the strait, but they were chased and hit near dawn by more 8-inch fire from Portland and Pensacola, and after colliding with the cruiser Nachi and receiving 2 bomb hits from carrier planes, Mogami was abandoned later that morning. Portland spent the next few days protecting the transports off Leyte from over 60 air attacks, both of the conventional and kamikaze variety, before retiring to Ulithi on November 1st. During her 2 weeks off Leyte, her crew had been called to general quarters 89 times, but no rest would be had, as she got underway the next day with Task Group 38.1 of the Fast Carrier Task Force, which included the carriers Wasp, Hornet, and Monterey. Portland screened her charges for the rest of November as they struck targets throughout the Philippines, including several massive strikes on the island of Luzon. She returned to the Leyte area in early December for some rest and replenishment before supporting the invasion of Mindoro on the 15th. The rest of the month was spent dodging kamikazes and supporting operations ashore. On January 5, 1945, she began shelling Japanese positions throughout Lingayen Gulf in support of landings by the U.S. Army on the 9th. From February 1944 to July 1945, Portland was under the command of Captain Thomas G.W. Settle, who, much like Captain DuBose, was tough but fair and well-liked by his crew. He showed his seamanship throughout this period by skillfully maneuvering Portland out of harm's way on numerous occasions, particularly from threatening kamikazes. On January 6, 1945, in the midst of one such attack, Captain Settle ordered a hard turn to port to throw off a plane that had just begun its suicidal dive. The attacker appeared to be heading for Portland's bridge, but was forced to pull a loop maneuver and crashed into the fantail of the light cruiser USS Columbia instead. Portland continued shelling enemy positions and fighting off kamikaze attacks into mid-February. On the 15th, she entered Manila Bay and bombarded the island of Corregidor in preparation for landings there on the 16th. She hung around the Manila Bay area until late February, when she retired to Leyte once again for rest, repairs, and replenishment. From March 26th through April 20th, Portland conducted operations off Okinawa. She shelled Japanese positions on the island, before and after troops were ashore. The Sweet Pea endured 24 air raids during these 3 weeks, in which her gunners shot down 4 enemy aircraft and assisted in downing 2 others. In late March, a Japanese midget submarine was sighted in close proximity to the cruiser, but the sub failed to strike her, and Captain Settle was unsuccessful in his attempt to ram it. After retiring to Ulithi for rest and replenishment in late April, Portland was back off Okinawa on May 8th, where she patrolled and provided fire support until the island was declared secure in mid-June. Portland then spent most of the summer of 1945 in the Leyte area for upkeep and training. She returned to Okinawa and dropped anchor in Buckner Bay on the southeastern coast of the island on August 6th and remained there until the cessation of hostilities on August 15th. Portland got underway not long after, with Vice Admiral George D. Murray on board, to accept the formal capitulation of the senior Japanese military officials at Truk Atoll on September 2nd. The ceremonies were held on her quarterdeck, and dress whites were the uniform of the day for her crew. The Japanese officers were dressed in their best uniforms as well, and were directed to the table where the documents were upon embarking the Sweet Pea. The signings were done in haste. And just like that, the war in the Pacific was over for the crew of the USS Portland. After a short visit to Guam, Portland returned to Pearl Harbor on September 21st and embarked 600 military personnel for transportation to the United States. She transited the Panama Canal on October 8th and arrived in Portland, Maine for Navy Day celebrations on October 27th. She then conducted 2 transatlantic crossings in November and December to bring troops home from the European theater. In March 1946, Portland reported to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard for inactivation. She was decommissioned on July 12, 1946, and assigned to the United States Reserve Fleet. And there she sat for the next 12-plus years, until she was struck from the Naval Vessel Register on March 1, 1959. She was sold on October 6th of that year and broken up during 1961 and 1962. Today, her foremast and bridge structure stand as memorials to the sacrifices of her gallant and resilient crew at Fort Allen Park in downtown Portland, Maine. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe so that we can bring you more content like this.